In the late 1920s, the German cruise liner SS Cap Arcona is queen of the South Atlantic.
We forget before air travel, the way to get around, if you wanted to do it in style, was to go on a luxury liner.
The point of having the opulent ship is to be a showpiece for the world.
This ocean-going palace would become embroiled in many twists and turns in the service of the Nazis' regime.
The Cap Arcona had a varied history.
While World War II raged across the continent and beyond, Germany's finest ocean luxury liner set sail on a tale to ultimate catastrophe.
From luxury vessel to becoming a tragedy amongst tragedies.
Ending up as one of history's worst maritime disasters.
(1945), the end of World War II. The entire continent of Europe is in disarray. Cities reduced to rubble, and millions of people killed, injured, or displaced. As the Allies uncover the destruction the Nazis visited upon the world, secret documents about one particular series of events are carefully classified and hidden away, never to be seen for decades. At the center of this story is one ship, the Cap Arcona.
I mean, the beauty of the Second World War is the amount of information that was recorded in multiple different ways. Of course, you've got reams and reams of official reports and diaries and letters, and you've also got the technological advances.
This is material that could jeopardize our national security.
It's not surprising that a lot of this information does get buried for one reason or another. It might be deliberate, it might be accidental.
There's lots that we don't want revealed.
Why would anyone want to dredge up the horrors of war, especially one on the magnitude of World War II, after the war had ended?
The story of the Cap Arcona starts at the end of the First World War, as Germany is in a dismal place. The country is in economic ruin, forced to accept responsibility for the conflict and pay huge reparations.
The story of Germany in the 1920s is very interesting. I mean, post-war, of course, it's on its knees. It's just been humiliated in a war. But it also has the economic issue of recovering from all that expenditure and the reparations which the Allies are making them pay.
Germany is deindustrialized, demilitarized, it's paying steep reparations. It's emasculated, it's feeling really sorry for itself. You know, it's got hyperinflation. It's a country on its knees.
Although Germany is in the midst of economic ruin and recovering from the loss of the First World War, one aggressive and well-managed shipbuilder defies the odds.
Blum and Voss, one of the world's greatest shipbuilders, still in business today, and Hamburg Süd, one of the greatest ship operators still in business today, they launched this idea that they're going to build the greatest ship afloat as a way of getting Germany back into maritime business, but also for purposes of pride.
Inspired by the Titanic, no expense will be spared in the creation of this magnificent cruise ship.
When you hear about the scale of both the cost of the Cap Arcona and really, you know, its facilities on board, it's mind-boggling. You know, 35 billion Reichsmarks to build. You know, the luxury was off the scale. A full-size tennis court, an indoor ballroom. The apartments themselves had silk upholstery on the furniture, full-length baths. You know, almost no effort had been spared in creating this unbelievably luxurious vessel.
It's an absolute magnificent luxury ship, very much in keeping with the 1920s.
It's about enjoying oneself and the rise of consumerism and luxury.
And that opulence would eventually see the Cap Arcona become part of the Nazi Party's propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels.
Joseph Goebbels' rise to power was meteoric. Goebbels had exactly what Hitler and the Nazis were looking for. He was brilliant, he was fanatical, and he lacked any sense of humanity.
It's not surprising given what his skill set was. His skill set was convincing people of certain ideas and certain ideologies.
It's funny, isn't it? Goebbels is such a curious character, carrying around almost like a carbuncle or a cannonball behind him, this giant inferiority complex. And I think he respects, loves Hitler's single-mindedness,
consequently, in no time at all, he's one of Hitler's right-hand men as the minister of the Department of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment.
There is a talent for the mastery of language, manipulation through imagery and messaging, and the way in which he's able to harbour that talent, the outlet that he's provided for this talent is through the vehicle of National Socialism, through Hitler's Nazi Party.
In the late 1920s, Goebbels was tasked with reorganizing and publicizing the largely ignored Nazi Party. At that same time, finally finished, the Cap Arcona is christened on May 14, 1927.
The launching of the Cap Arcona in 1927, a near replica of the Titanic, that was a source of great pride for the German people. Not only practically did that ship get Germany back into the cruising and maritime business, but it was held up as a source of German might and pride.
There was a level of opulence and luxury enjoyed that hadn't been seen for quite some time.
This incredibly sophisticated, luxurious vessel, known as the Queen of the South Atlantic, was drawing people from all, walks of life, but, people with money and influence. So there would be Hollywood film stars going on board, members of the royalty, captains of industry. They were flocking to this ship, and this ship, of course, represented the technological rebirth of Germany after the First World War.
It is the sort of rise before the fall, isn't it? The pride before the fall in many respects. Because decadence, frivolity, pleasure is not something that is the focus of German politics in the later 1930s.
However, the story of the Cap Arcona would be short-lived. About 8 years from the day she was launched, she would be destroyed. But how and why would remain a mystery for decades to come. In 1975, after 30 years of silence, a small number of classified World War II documents are released under the British government's National Secret Act. These documents describe a terrible tragedy at sea involving the Cap Arcona, which cost tens of thousands of accidental deaths.
Britain has a variety of rules governing the classification of sensitive documents.
A lot of archives and a lot of national papers just simply aren't released into the public for a set number of years.
Pretty much anything sensitive at the end of the Second World War would have been buried in the archives. Now, that doesn't mean it's being hidden, and it doesn't mean it's being destroyed, although that could happen, and historians often believe it does happen. But it does mean that there's going to be a minimum period of time until the public are going to be able to see this material. And in some instances, other things are kept back even longer.
Although the Cap Arcona is the peak of German luxury, things were about to go seriously wrong with the stock market crash of 1929. Germany is once again in financial devastation.
I mean, the tragedy for Germany is really the economic disaster at the end of the 1920s, the crash in the United States, that affected the whole of the world. So you've got the Great Depression in the 1930s. Germany was as affected by that as everyone else. So this small economic resurgence, which seemed to be gathering pace, is stopped in its tracks. You get a real sense of not only economic hardship, but also political grievance. And the combination of these two factors will explain the rise of a party that promises to make Germany great again.
In 1933, Hitler is appointed chancellor to assist with the economic stabilization of Germany, but quickly begins to implement racist and fascist policies in order to seize total control of the country. Germany's days as a peaceful nation are over. The Nazis are coming.
Hitler comes along and is very good at blame-mongering, scapegoating, playing the us versus them card.
He demonizes all those who he deems as others in Germany, and they're the ones who are responsible for the economic turmoil.
So they channel their frustration, and in that respect, they prove they have raw talent. They have raw talent for manipulation, for commandeering the masses, for puppeteering, if you like, great swathes of the population. How did the most educated country in Europe end up voting for National Socialism and Hitler as Chancellor?
Propaganda campaigns led by Joseph Goebbels, heralding Aryan superiority, sweep through Germany, as a two-tiered society is created between Aryans and inferiors. Gradually, the Nazi regime begins building concentration camps to imprison these groups of people, as well as any political opponents. Blatantly defying the Treaty of Versailles signed after World War I, Hitler begins rapidly rebuilding and rearming the German military. As a result, the world's rich and famous turn their backs on the Cap Arcona.
The Cap Arcona's popularity diminishes precipitously once the Nazis come to power.
Far from being a symbol of a resurgent nation that people want to be associated with, it now becomes a symbol of Nazism.
Having lost all appeal as a tourist destination under the Nazi regime, the Cap Arcona makes its final voyage on August 24, 1939. But it leaves South America with only 2 passengers making the return trip back to Germany. The very next day, another German ship, the Schleswig-Holstein, a battleship, arrives in the Polish port of Danzig.
I mean, the interesting thing about German sea power is what happens with the cruiser, the Schleswig-Holstein, because it is sent to Danzig, which is a free port, but in the Polish corridor, which is a strip of land which has been taken off Germany at the end of the First World War and given to Poland.
Unbeknownst to the greeting crowd, the Schleswig-Holstein is carrying 300 heavily armed German assault troops below deck, preparing to initiate an attack which would result in a global conflict. In the early morning hours of September 1st, the Schleswig-Holstein slips out of the moorings and glides downstream to anchor with a clear view of the Polish garrison. At 4:47 a.m., the hidden assault troops emerged and unleashed their weapons on the garrison, commencing the German invasion of Poland.
Hitler invades Poland with a blitzkrieg operation. Now everything changes.
The Polish cities Warsaw and Krakow are bombed, and the port city of Danzig, which is a strategic location in the Baltics, is annexed. The Nazis refuse to withdraw their troops, and 2 days later, France and Britain declare war on Germany. Meanwhile, the Cap Arcona is about to play a new role.
The Cap Arcona is sailing back to Germany just days before World War II breaks out. The captain receives a communication, make immediate plans to get back to a port.
I mean, ultimately, what tends to happen in any nation during wartime is that a lot of civil shipping will be requisitioned by the government. It happened in Britain, it happened in America during the Second World War to assist with the war.
This is a sizable vessel, and you're at war. You need to train, you need to house your navy, and it's an obvious stopgap solution.
The Cap Arcona makes its way to the port of Gotenhafen. On arrival, the ship is painted military gray, and its fine furnishings are removed as it transforms into a barracks for German sailors. A far cry from its days of hosting royalty and celebrities on board. Although transformed, its former opulence will not be forgotten.
In early 2014, I was working on a book on the final week of the war in Europe. And I was looking for stories of love and loss, triumph and tragedy, as a way of capturing the power of the last week of the world's worst war. And pretty much by dumb luck, which is oftentimes how the process of discovery works, I found a letter from a Major Till in the British Army where he essentially says he'd never seen or experienced anything as horrific as what happened on the Cap Arcona in the final days of the war. And I thought to myself, what is that? I'd never heard of it.
So when you're doing research and you find something that's unexpected, most of the time you want to find out more.
Safely back at port, the Cap Arcona has now taken up her new military role in the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. Meanwhile, as a result of their invasion of Poland, the Nazis secure the Baltic Sea as their domain.
The Baltic is of vital importance, and it also prevents you from being landlocked. You need to be able to get in fuel, food, munitions. It's the thoroughfare. It's the highway. It's like the ultimate motorway. And it's also somewhere where you can train your naval servicemen.
Having repurposed the Cap Arcona, German sailors perform exercises on the upper decks and use the cabins below as their sleeping quarters.
It's also such an advanced ship that her engine, her propulsion systems, her navigational systems were the state of the art.
However, the eventual destruction of this magnificent ship still remained a mystery.
So I kept doing research, and I found a second letter from a general named Mills Roberts. He was the general in charge of the British 6th Commando.
This letter references 2 attacks against his Nazi ship in Lübeck Bay, immediately establishing a connection to the first document written by Major Till.
So now that there's 2 bits of information, then it's going to be easier to keep looking longer and harder.
The most obvious question that I had, that anybody would have, is why would a British general and a British major consider the destruction of a German ship at the end of World War II to be a tragedy? General Mills Roberts was a hardened veteran. You would think that nothing would bother someone like that. And for him to basically see this as one of the worst things he'd ever seen in his entire life, it had to be bad.
With no sign of slowing down their aggressive expansionist ambitions, the Nazis launched their invasion of Norway. They will rely heavily on their Kriegsmarine for this coastal assault.
The story of Norway is very interesting because you've got Denmark, which falls very quickly, but Norway doesn't. Norway fights really hard against the Germans. It's determined to resist. And it's at this point that the Allies try to fight back. So there's a lot of naval action going on in that early campaign in Norway. And a lot of Kriegsmarine ships are sunk. They're losing a lot of ships, a lot of destroyers. They're losing some even bigger ships than that. And this shows you how important this war effort was.
If the Nazis can control the Norwegian ports, they're very much in control of that entire region.
With the Nazis now occupying Poland, Denmark, Norway, France, and the Low Countries, they control vast swaths of the European continent. Their next target is the UK. Lying vulnerable and alone in the English Channel, Hitler makes plans for an amphibious assault to capture Britain and take full control of the seas.
Hitler was obsessed with Britain. That was his rival, as he saw it.
Sea Lion is the code for the German invasion of the United Kingdom, and it's, of course, a massive undertaking. And then to make matters worse, of course, the Germans are going to preface it all by heavy bombing.
In July 1940, the Luftwaffe begins an air and sea blockade in preparation for Operation Sea Lion. They target coastal infrastructure and shipping operations in the English Channel. This is the first major air attack in World War II.
The Battle of Britain unfolds in quite a curious way. The initial strategy by the Germans made a lot of sense, which is to target communication centers and also airfields. So you're basically knocking out the enemy air force. Because they don't have initial success from July onwards, the Germans decide to switch tactics and target London, almost as though they're going to bomb us into submission.
And squadron after squadron fly across the English Channel to bomb Britain back to the Stone Ages, and in one of history's greatest upsets, a few RAF, Royal Air Force pilots, defeat the Luftwaffe.
It's one of the first German defeats, the Battle of Britain. They don't achieve air superiority, and the Blitz in many ways can be read as a desperate act, an act of desperation.
With the Nazis unable to defeat the British, Joseph Goebbels wants to launch another attack to weaken their resolve, this time using propaganda.
Goebbels, the propaganda chief, so, frustrated and outraged is he that Britain's still fighting on, that he decides to create a kind of propaganda tool that is going to take the wind out of our sails as he perceives it.
Goebbels did several things for Hitler. He was a captivating speaker, fanatically loyal, devoted, but one of the things was make movies. Joseph Goebbels produced or was a part of hundreds of films.
A recognition that this was a powerful medium was understood by the Nazis, particularly by Goebbels early on.
The British Navy for hundreds of years has been one of the most powerful in the world. And Hitler and Goebbels not only want to defeat Britain, they want to embarrass Britain, but first and foremost, the British Navy, the Royal Navy. And what better way to do this than to point out that Britain's Titanic had sunk, while Germany's Titanic, the Cap Arcona, was still afloat.
In April 1912, on its maiden voyage, the Titanic, a luxurious passenger ship, a liner with such advanced engineering it was deemed unsinkable, headed across the Atlantic from Southampton to New York with 2,240 passengers and crew on board. But just 4 days into its journey, it hit an iceberg and sank.
The press throughout the UK was very much promoting it as a symbol of British ingenuity and British strength.
So when the Titanic goes down after hitting the iceberg, she takes roughly 1,500 souls down with her, making this, at the time, one of history's deadliest maritime disasters.
Recognizing the fact the Titanic disaster is a delicate moment in British history, Goebbels plans to use this tragedy as the centerpiece for his propaganda campaign to demoralize the British.
Hitler and Goebbels were fascinated with movies. They loved Hollywood films. They watched them all the time. It was not uncommon for them to watch 2 or 3 back-to-back with translators and interpreters.
Goebbels decides that the best way to get back at the British morale is to make a film about the sinking of the Titanic.
So he comes up with this idea that, you make a film about the Titanic in order to portray the British Navy as incompetent and as ruthless and as stupid and all of these things, with the grand design that the German people will believe it and therefore want to launch an attack against the United Kingdom or support that kind of an attack.
Although she may have survived longer, the Cap Arcona would eventually follow the same fate as the Titanic and end up sinking. Bit by bit, her final story was unfolding. Having discovered 2 documents hinting at tragedy surrounding the Cap Arcona, the search for answers intensifies.
The first thing I did after finding those letters was I went online. I didn't try to go to an archive or look for books, just went online. So I was sketching out different scenarios that might have happened at the end of the war based on the little bit that Till said, the little bit that Mills Roberts said, and what was said in the obituaries. And I was able to come up with some, what seemed to be pretty reasonable guesses. It involved a ship. It took place in the final days of the war. It was in the Baltic Sea. It was tragic. It was so important that the documents were probably classified. So you put those little breadcrumbs together and it starts walking you into some explanations of what may have happened.
Hidden stories are constantly re-emerging through documentary evidence, through archaeological evidence, and occasionally through someone's memory that's never been challenged before. There are so many stories, particularly these smaller ones, that have been forgotten or been buried, that will be resurrected at some point.
In June 1941, Germany launches Operation Barbarossa. They set their sights on conquering Russia, opening up a new Eastern Front.
Operation Barbarossa was one of the largest, most ambitious military actions in world history. Hitler's going to send multiple divisions into the Soviet Union. And in a way, it's the turning point of the war.
This large-scale surprise assault consists of over 3 million German soldiers, who initially overwhelmed the Russian army.
I mean, you can see from the launch of Operation Barbarossa that while you've got the military troops at the front, at the tip of the spear, so to speak, following very close behind are these murderous squads of Einsatzgruppen. So clearly the policy is dual-edged from the start, which is that you're going to defeat the Russian enemy, but while you're defeating them, you're going to kill off anyone you consider to be undesirable.
This is hell on earth, even in the hellish nature of World War II globally. This is a real epicenter.
As the scale of the war continues to grow, Goebbels is busy making his propaganda film to undermine the British Navy. He hires German director Herbert Selpin to bring his vision of the Nazi Titanic to life.
He's the best-known German film director. He's not that pro-Nazi, but he is very anti-British, so he's the right guy for this type of job. And he's also, at the top of his game. And he brings on his childhood friend, who is a Nazi ideologue.
Walter Zerlett Olfenius had been a screenwriter in Germany since 1936.
What Hitler wanted, and then ultimately what Goebbels wants, he doesn't want a typical Goebbels ham-fisted propaganda film. He wants an action, drama, romance hybrid, just like the Hollywood blockbusters like Casablanca. And that's what Celpin specialized in.
He's got an offer that's too good for him to refuse. A huge budget, huge support, the starting point for his own Hollywood. And in essence, I expect that he thought he would be a big player in that new Hollywood for years and years to come.
Meanwhile, despite their initial success, the Nazis are unable to dominate Russia as quickly as they planned, and they're severely unprepared for the harsh winter conditions. In December 1941, the Red Army launches a massive counterattack against the Nazis, driving them back from Moscow in utter chaos.
The writing is really on the wall when they're turned back from Moscow in terrible winter conditions. The Russians counterattack. Germans are pushed all the way back to a line from which, although they will advance from a little bit, they never get back to Moscow.
As we get to the stage in the war where Germany is losing, the front with Russia has turned into a very hard front that they're now retreating backwards from. You've got a huge morale problem.
In early 1942, filming of the Nazi Titanic propaganda film finally begins at Berlin's high-end Tobe studios. Goebbels secures a budget of 4 million Reichsmarks, the largest film budget in the world at the time.
Goebbels has got the green light to go from Hitler to do this. There's a massive budget.
They reassign entire military units to be extras, the cast of thousands. They find the most beautiful German models, the most handsome matinee actors, the best set builders and carpenters, and they spare no expense.
Hitler's interest in the film would have put more pressure on Goebbels than Celpin because of the great personal admiration that Goebbels had for Hitler.
Meanwhile, Goebbels' Titanic propaganda project is going terribly. Director Celpin's Hollywood behavior reaches a new level of demanding. He insists on using a ship from the German Navy to be a centerpiece of action in this film.
So you've got all these kind of creative nightmares, you've got giant egos, you've got ridiculous amounts of cash, despite, rations and restrictions, and you can't get the sinking of the ship that you need to make your movie the blockbuster that Goebbels wants and that Celpin wants.
The movie is running over budget, behind schedule, and Hitler wants his movie, so he's breathing down Goebbels' neck. Goebbels wants his movie, so he's breathing down Celpin's neck.
To create a film about the Titanic, you have to have a scene with an iceberg. That is a necessity. Celpin obviously wants it to be grand. He wants it to look as good as possible, because that has been his motivation seemingly throughout the entire filming process.
To satisfy Celpin's latest demands, Goebbels leans in on the Kriegsmarine to present several different ship options to use in the film.
If they're going to make a film about the Titanic, they have a replica of the Titanic sitting on the Polish coast.
What better, the ship that was in effect the Titanic of the 1920s and 1930s, the Cap Arcona.
You paint it, you make sure it is restored to the point where people look at it and they say, like, that's the Titanic.
Having secured the Cap Arcona, Celpin relocates the entire cast and crew to the southern Baltic. Goebbels arranges for German naval officers to be used as extras for the film. Filming is scheduled to resume April 29, 1942, but it doesn't go as planned.
Basically, anything that could go wrong went wrong. The weather doesn't cooperate. One of the lead actresses gets pregnant from one of the soldiers or sailors on set. The sailors and soldiers on set are getting drunk and wrecking the set. People are having too much fun not serving in the war, therefore they don't memorize their lines. Everything is going wrong. All that is grating on the perfectionist Herbert Celpin's nerves.
Celpin is a person who's supposed to be in control, and he's being given situations and circumstances that are out of his control, especially when you're putting in military personnel, naval officers on the ship as extras. He's just building up stress until he gets to a breaking point.
What's even more pointed is that he talks about it. And that's where the director makes a fatal mistake. He assumes that somehow he is above you know, the regular nightmare that is Nazi oppression. And so he speaks rather freely about the problems, and ultimately that speaks ill of the boss, who is Goebbels.
There was no freedom of thought.
After Selpin's meltdown on set, Zerlett resigns from working on the film. A loyal Nazi, he boards a train to Berlin and reports Selpin's behavior to the Gestapo, sealing the fate of his former childhood friend.
So Nazi Germany was all built on absolute, unquestioning devotion. People were encouraged to rat on their neighbors if somebody wasn't completely devoted. The Gestapo was everywhere. So when Herbert Selpin goes off on the Nazi party, he's summoned to Berlin.
So when Selpin is brought up to discuss his outburst, he's unrepentant. He may not have thought that it was as serious as it was, and that would be an error in judgment on his part, and he pays the price for it in the end.
Unapologetic about his disparaging remarks of the Nazi regime, Selpin is handed over to the Gestapo, charged with treason and disloyalty. Around midnight on July 31st, German guards visit Selpin's cell, only to find him hanged. The Nazi Titanic needs a new director.
With Selpin dead, Joseph Goebbels' epic propaganda film was in jeopardy. Not surprisingly, no other directors wanted to finish the film. They found a B director named Werner Klingner, who came in and finished the project.
It's presented, you know, with great fanfare to Goebbels, who watches it in a private viewing room, and slowly it dawns on him the full irony of what he's done. He's created, in the middle of what's becoming an increasingly desperate war that Germany is no longer winning, he's created a metaphor for Germany and its war effort. He's got a bunch of people heading towards disaster, led by a sort of unthinking, foolish leader. This is Germany.
Goebbels gets the balance wrong. He goes in too heavy with his anti-British narrative.
He thought that this film would work in the first place, and then, you know, much to his shock and horror, it's a terrible film, and he realizes that there's absolutely, you know, nothing that can be spun out of this.
Having the Kriegsmarine be in the position it is when the film is completed, and having so many individuals having been killed on the water, it is difficult to imagine that the German public would have responded well to this type of film.
Although forever immortalized on celluloid, the mystery of her real fate was still being investigated.
I contacted major Holocaust museums, I contacted major military history museums, World War II museums, and said to them, what is this unimaginable tragedy that occurred in the final days and hours of the war? And everybody said there was none.
Even though most government documents should be released now, after 30 years, we're going to keep some stuff back.
I contacted the archives in England. I contacted the archives and National Archives in Washington. I sent letters to museums. I called. I contacted prominent historians. And I either didn't get answers, or I got people saying, we don't have any information, or I've never heard of this. It's implausible.
After seeing the sinking of Titanic, meant to be the crown jewel to launch on Nazi Hollywood, Goebbels bans the film in Germany.
After such high expectations, after investing so much money and effort and time into this movie, it's not even shown. They don't get to use it. So it does not accomplish its purpose of changing the complexion of the war.
So after this, the Cap Arcona returns to its previous wartime use, which is as a training base.
In June 1944, the British, the Americans, and the Canadians stormed the beaches of Normandy during a massive amphibious assault known as D-Day.
D-Day is very much the signature day of the Allied war effort.
It's an absolute crucial, pivotal moment in the Second World War history.
It's the beginning of the end of the Nazi reign. The Allies are going to get a toehold on the continent.
D-Day is an overwhelming success.
As fate would have it, I get a chance to speak for the 70th anniversary of D-Day in Normandy. I'm on a luxury riverboat and giving some lectures at the Normandy landing beaches. And I meet an Academy Award-winning filmmaker there. We strike up a conversation. It turns out that I know her parents, and we have all these connections. And I tell her what I'm doing, and I say that I'm frustrated, I can't get information, and she says, well, let me make a phone call. I know, and she proceeds to tick off, some of the world's most important people. And my first thought is, yeah, right, because I didn't know her well. Sure, she'll make a phone call on my behalf. And sure enough, she did. And shortly thereafter, I got the call. We found the document.
Exactly 3 years after the German invasion of Russia, Operation Bagration begins. 2 million Red Army soldiers counterattack and begin pushing the Germans out of Russia. As payback to the Nazis for their savagery towards Russian soldiers and citizens, the Red Army soldiers are ruthless.
The Nazis would ultimately get a taste of their own medicine and what they did to the Russians. And the Red Army is leaving behind a trail of murder and destruction. Even though Stalin ordered them to race to Berlin, they are literally attacking, killing men, women, children, the elderly, burning the land, killing farm animals. A swath of destruction is headed toward Berlin.
As the Russians are coming through, civilians knowing or hearing about what has happened elsewhere, they want to get out.
To keep Reich citizens out of Russian hands, in January 1945, the Nazis launch Operation Hannibal. This operation is called by some the greatest evacuation operation in history.
Thousands and thousands of Germans, soldiers, the wounded, civilians, or just non-German residents of Eastern Europe are all racing to the Baltic to try to be evacuated before the Red Army strikes.
So you get this extraordinary evacuation of troops, of personnel, of civilians, of prisoners. It's like the great shift west.
There was definitely a lot of discussions in senior Nazi circles, SS and also the party itself, that they would create a last stand. And in many ways, you get the feeling that this was done, to please Hitler.
I think in Goebbels' and Hitler's mind, there were still people who cared. And while there were some, fanatics, the vast majority of Germans accepted the reality that they were doomed.
So there was a rumor at the end of the war that the Nazis were going to flee to make a one last stand, a final redoubt.
After years of sitting in the port of Gotenhafen as a floating barracks in a movie set, the rusted-out Cap Arcona is refitted to take on a more active role. The interior is stripped to make room for German refugees.
Even though the ship was in disrepair and was rusting, it's necessary to bring it into Operation Hannibal because you need all hands on deck.
It wasn't really, from all accounts, a seaworthy vessel at that point, but the fact that they needed to use it, or they felt they needed to use it, speaks to the dire straits that they were in, that they didn't have a better option.
This is an incredibly dangerous undertaking because, of course, the Baltic at this point, with the advance of the Russian armies, means that Russian submarines in particular are a threat. Earlier on in Operation Hannibal, a single ship was sunk by submarine and down went 10,000 lives. So, at any one of these moments, it could have been sunk with the loss of huge numbers of German civilians and German military personnel.
So could this mean the Cap Arcona was destroyed by a Russian submarine? After a relentless pursuit for answers on what actually happened to the Cap Arcona near the end of World War II, finally there's a breakthrough.
I got the call. We found the document, and there's 700 to 800 pages of classified documents, and it was sealed, not to be opened until the year 2045, and they're going to make it available and make the documents available to me. Would I like them? After I picked myself up off the floor, I'm like, yeah, can I get on the next flight, right?
Back in the Baltic Sea, the Cap Arcona has been successfully completing its missions to take German refugees from Poland to Denmark, managing to dodge any Russian submarines.
Ultimately, it was the Cap Arcona's sophisticated design that allows it to cross the Baltic and survive. The ship was so fast. It was so well built. Its hulls were reinforced. So the Cap Arcona's design still, built in 1927, but by 1945, it's still ahead of its time.
But while the Cap Arcona is on a trip back to Copenhagen, things are about to get worse.
So with the Red Army taking over Poland by April of 45, the Cap Arcona can no longer safely stay in port there. It was the subject of this propaganda film. It was Hitler's beloved ship. It was the Nazi Titanic. It has to flee, or the Soviet army would have arguably sunk it. It's relocated to Germany, to the German port.
It's ironic, I think, but probably just coincidental that the Cap Arcona is sent back to a German port in Neustadt Bay at the same time that Himmler gives the order that all the camps, the concentration camps, are to be liquidated and that no living inmate is to fall into Allied hands. That doesn't necessarily mean they're to be executed, but of course some people, some camp commandants and senior party officials may have thought it did.
Some commandants decide to evacuate their camps and head for the Baltic Sea, force marching their prisoners.
These death marches are just horrific. Some of the survivors of it describe tripping over all the bodies that had fallen in front of them from the front of the line if they're in the back of the line. So you have these long snaking trails of death leading to the Baltic coast.
The death march's destination is Lübeck Bay. Unbeknownst to the prisoners, they're marching towards the Cap Arcona.
So I remember when I got all these documents, now the hard work begins. I've got hundreds and hundreds of pages of stuff, and I got to make sense out of it, and it was just haphazardly put together. So the first thing I did was I tried to organize it chronologically, then organize it by topic. I cleared everything off the floor, and then I just got piles, and I put it in piles, and I made lines to everything. Hour by hour, day by day, and I organized everything chronologically, then I marked everything chronologically. After that, then I organized it by topic, by event, or by individual.
On April 17, 1945, thousands of Death March survivors arrive in Lübeck Bay.
So those who are able to make it, they start to load in, they start to aboard the Cap Arcona and the other ships, and you wonder what they were thinking in that moment, having gone through what they went through, and just the uncertainty that I'm sure they were facing, the fear that must have been present.
Meanwhile, the British receive intelligence reports that multiple large Kriegsmarine ships are congregating in German waters along the Baltic coast. Trying to finish off the war, they begin plans for an attack to ensure there is no chance of the Nazis escaping by ship to make a last stand.
There are 4 big ships in Lübeck Bay near the port of Neustadt. There's 2 freighters trawlers, the Theelbeck and the Aten, and there's 2 big ocean liners, the Deutschland and the Cap Arcona. Around this time, there's the rumor that the Germans are going to flee to Norway for one last stand.
The Allies were using a lot of reconnaissance, aerial reconnaissance, taking pictures from above, and they wouldn't necessarily have had the details to see who was on the ship, who was being loaded on those ships, but they would see how many. And they would be able to see that the ships were lower and lower in the water as they were loaded up with more people. So you could tell when the ship is empty, you could tell when the ship is full. You could tell when the ship is overfull. And that's the information that they, when they say believe your eyes, that's what they're seeing. But it doesn't have the level of detail that lets them know exactly what's going on in there.
And you have to go into war knowing the only way to win it is to annihilate the enemy.
On April 26, the SS commandeers the Cap Arcona and the other ships in Lübeck Bay, officially turning them into floating concentration camps. The guards occupy the luxurious suites on the upper decks, while the prisoners are put below.
So in late April and early May of 1945, the final days, the final hours of the war, you have all these prisoners at the port, you have this massive Titanic ship at anchor off the coast, and there's this macabre scene where every hour or two they're shuttling prisoners out to the Cap Arcona and stuffing them in the deep, dark holds of the ship. No food, no water.
The Swedish Red Cross obtains information that the RAF are plotting an airstrike in the port of Lübeck. Knowing this will mean certain death for the concentration camp survivors aboard the Cap Arcona and the other ships, they try to warn the RAF to call off the attack.
So because the information isn't passed on, or it is passed on and it's ignored, an attack is put in against these vessels in Neustadt Bay.
Once the RAF goes forth with the airstrike, there's nothing that those on board the ships can do.
At 05:30 in the morning, 6 squadrons of Typhoon bombers took off from liberated air bases across Europe. Their target was Lubeck Bay. In particular, the target is any large ship. They fly in that morning. It's cloudy, it's rainy, it's overcast, the worst kind of weather. They can't see. They return to base. They have to refuel and wait for the clouds to dissipate. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, they fly back in. It's still cloudy and rainy, but not as bad. They drop down below the clouds, and what do they see? The largest ship anybody's ever seen, the Cap Arcona. She's low in the water, which means she's full of people and full of fuel. So the 6 squadrons of Typhoon bombers all target the Cap Arcona.
The British pilots commence a devastating air attack on Lubeck Bay, unleashing a total of 64 rockets and 15 bombs onto the Cap Arcona and surrounding ships.
They were going out with the mission that they were taking out a military target. They had no idea anything else was happening there.
If you're the Royal Air Force, the last thing you want is for this war to continue. This is the world's bloodiest war, 60 to 80 million people around the world dead. They want to do anything and everything they can to prevent these ships from getting to Norway. So these Typhoon bombers, these Royal Air Force Typhoon bombers, are going to hunt and target every large ship they can find off the German coast.
With the pilots facing little to no resistance or return fire, they dominate the sky above Lubeck Bay. While down below, a hellish nightmare is unfolding for all those aboard the ships.
They target the Cap Arcona. Gaping holes are torn into the ship from all the explosions. Freezing cold water fills the ship, so if you're below the water line, you have no chance. Those on the top decks, as the ship starts to list and roll over, the big funnels, the smokestacks, are breaking off and like a giant bowling ball, crushing people.
I can't imagine what it'd be like being on that ship after it was struck with bombs and it's on fire.
There were some survivors of this horrific incident. It's hard to put an exact number on it. I estimate maybe as many as 350. One of them was a young boy named Berek Jakubowicz. He was Polish, as the name would suggest. He survived concentration camps, the Death March, and days in the deep hold of the ship. He was there with his brother Józek. When a gaping hole was torn into the side of the ship, freezing cold water came pouring in. Almost everybody inside was either dead or died, drowned, because you're in no condition to swim. These 2 young boys managed to tread water. At the last minute, some of the concentration camp prisoners from the top deck bravely risked their lives to go below decks on a ship that's on fire and rolling over and is still being bombed. They went below decks and opened the hatch, and hands came down and pulled the 2 Jakubowicz brothers out.
As the British airstrikes continue to target the Cap Arcona, Nazi units are patrolling the beaches, searching for any surviving prisoners that may have made it to shore. Tragically, hundreds of prisoners that survived the terrible nightmare on the Cap Arcona are gunned down on land.
What makes this ever more pitiful is the end of the war is literally a day or 2 away.
The British 6th Commando and others who liberated the port, and their general, a fellow named Mills Roberts, as well as Major Till, who was ordered to document all this, realized what had happened, that thousands and thousands of concentration camp prisoners were killed mistakenly by the Royal Air Force. And that was the reasoning behind requesting that all these documents be sealed top secret for 100 years. And I'm not defending that. But in some ways, you think about this, after the war ends, the public was in no mood for more stories of death and loss. They wanted to move forward with their lives. They needed to rebuild, and nobody wanted to look back, especially at a tragedy of this magnitude. So the British were able to successfully classify and seal these documents away from public information and from, prying eyes for decades.
From an Allied perspective, on the cusp of victory, you need to deliver your public an untarnished victory.
It's such a desperate scramble to get back into a peaceful world and to curate a better, healthier, happier narrative that almost there isn't the scrutiny there needs to be over what we can and can't read.
The Cap Arcona remains capsized in Lübeck Bay until 1949, when the Soviets bring it on land to salvage. Today, there is nothing that remains of the Cap Arcona. One of the largest ships ever built has completely vanished. But after decades of being buried, her story is finally out in the open.
Uncovering this story is probably the most important thing professionally I think I've ever done. I've spent years with this story now, from researching it to writing it to talking about it to working on this project here. And after all these years, I still have trouble almost believing that any of it's real. It's so surreal. It's so bizarre and fantastical. But you know, when it comes to Nazi Germany, when it comes to ideas that people like Hitler and Goebbels had, nothing is too bizarre.
It's important that history shines a light on all these sorts of stories so that we're honest with ourselves as a nation about what we've done in the past and what we're capable of doing.
In this case, we're not only supposed to learn from it, but also to remember it and to understand what's happened and to do better.
I hate everything to do with war, but pretending like it doesn't happen and not respecting the lives lost, the sacrifices made, the innocents that are killed.
I felt a real heavy sense of responsibility that I had to tell this story. There was no way I wasn't. I would get in the Atlantic and swim across the ocean to unearth whatever could be. And I still feel a sense of responsibility even now just talking about this, because it's such a heavy and just a shocking and important story.